In Chapter 6, I really focus on what we call the ABCs of dog training. And what that means is it's actually how dogs learn. In reality, it's even how people learn. So if we break it down, the ABCs. So I'm going to mix up the letters a little bit and call B is the behavior. So that's the behavior we want. It's the behavior we don't want. It is the behavior that's happening. So that's in the middle of our ABCs. And then before the behavior happens, there's usually what we call an antecedent or a cue. The antecedent, it is what triggers the behavior to happen. And then at the end, the C is the consequence that happens after the behavior. Sometimes the consequence is good and sometimes the consequence is bad. So when we look at our ABCs, that is how animals learn or how people learn. It's also how we can change the response. So for a driving example for humans I like to use is when you see a red light, that's the cue to push the brake. So you push the brake and so your car stops. Now, most of us as humans have learned the reason we do that is because we are trying to avoid a negative consequence of getting hit by a car in an intersection, or we don't want to get a ticket. So our fear of a negative consequence is what helps reinforce the stopping behavior of pushing on the brake when we see the red light. A dog example is that when we say sit, the dog sits, they get a treat. The treat reinforces the behavior. So next time you say sit and your dog sits, they're more likely to sit because they're anticipating they're going to get a treat or something good. At work, you may have a project and the behavior of getting that project done and doing a good job is because you want the consequence maybe of a raise or a bonus. And the trigger or the antecedent to doing that project oftentimes is that your boss has asked you to, or in some situations where maybe you're self-employed, the behavior is triggered or your antecedent is a goal that you have for your business. And then the consequence is positive, hopefully, if you get more business or you get a bonus from that project. So that's what the ABCs are like. And I have a nice little map that I've created to help you see this, and especially if you're trying to undo a behavior, it's a lot easier to see this when you're trying to teach a behavior. So you know you want to teach sit, down, or come, and you use a treat as a consequence. There's your reinforcer, and you add the cue or the word that cues that behavior to happen. But when we look at a map of it, it will help you. So if you're trying to undo a behavior, you can understand it a little bit further. So with the map, you have the A. So you can see the A is in this square, and it's what happens right before the behavior happens. Then the B is the behavior. What is the behavior that your pet does? And what happens, the C is the consequence of what happens immediately after the behavior. And what we want to look at is sometimes consequences are reinforcing, so they increase the behavior, and sometimes they're punishing, so they decrease the behavior. So if we're looking at some different examples, maybe your dog barks to get your attention. So the behavior is barking, and maybe it's when you're in the kitchen and you're not paying attention to them, they bark. So the antecedent is they've learned, usually these behaviors are learned because you're in the kitchen, you're making dinner, you're not paying attention to them. That cues them to bark, hoping to get your attention. And if you do give them your attention, so you look at them, you tell them quiet, you just reinforce that behavior. Now, if you wanted to change that behavior, so your dog barks at you when you're in the kitchen and you walk out of the kitchen as a consequence and you completely ignore them, that could stop the barking behavior because you're no longer reinforcing it. But you could also look at it as something different, and you could completely just redirect the behavior. So if your dog always barks at you while you're cooking dinner, Then before you cook dinner, you give them a stuffed Kong. You stuff it with lots of yummy things and you give it to them. Now, instead of barking, when you're cooking, they're going to play with their Kong, and their consequence is that they get to eat their yummy treats. So by learning this map of ABC behavior, you can undo a lot of behaviors. You can also look at why your dog is learning or not learning something. A really good example of this is for walks. So sometimes I have dogs who really don't like walks, but the people want them to go on a walk. And so they have the behavior of, they see the leash or the collar, then the dog runs and hides under the bed, so that would go under the B. The behavior is go under the bed, and then they don't if the people give up and don't walk them, they just were reinforced for going under the bed when they saw the leash. If your dog likes walks, and the ABC of a walk would be, they see the leash, they know they're gonna go on a walk, they get really excited, you put the leash on and you take them on a walk, and the consequence is positive. So now they want to go on more walks. And so when you're looking at the ABCs of behavior, it's important to really think about what is the consequence that's happening after the behavior and what is the antecedent or the cue that happens before the behavior. Now, when you're also training dogs, you look at different ways of capturing the behavior or how to teach them. We commonly use luring, where you have a treat in your hand. This is commonly used for sit. You lure the dog into a sit, you have a treat in your fingers, and you raise the treat over their head and their bottom hits the ground, and you now have a sit. That's a luring type of behavior or training technique. Then we also have shaping, where shaping is something that we do little increments to get to the goal. So a good shaping is in weave pulls. So if you've ever watched agility, dogs weave through those pulls really quickly. Well, they don't just learn that behavior on their own, they gradually learn how to weave each pull, which is a shaping exercise. So they have little tiny increments that eventually lead to the ultimate goal. That's more of shaping. Then we also have capturing. So capturing is fun to do sometimes when your dog does something cute and they do it on a regular basis. You can capture it by reinforcing it every time it happens. A good example I have of that is that I was teaching Captain to put his head on his paws, just as a little head down. And it used to be that when we got ready for bed, I'd be sitting on the edge of my bed and he would be staring at me, laying down, just staring at me. And then he'd get kind of bored and he would put his head on his paws. Well, I brought a clicker and a treat into the bedroom and I hid him in my pocket, so he had no idea we were gonna have a training session. And he was staring at me, and as soon as he put his head on his paws, I clicked and I gave him a treat. The first time he kind of looked at me like, what's going on? Why did you give me that treat? He didn't know what his body had just done. So then we waited and I got quiet and he thought, well, I guess we're not training anymore. And he got relaxed and then he did it again. And I clicked and I treated. That time, because Captain is clicker savvy, I think my mom's trying to teach me something. And so then he sat there and waited again and did it a third time. The third time, he was pretty sure he was doing something that I liked. And then he sort of offered me a real cautious head on the paw, and I clicked and treated, and you could almost see the light bulb go off. And next thing I knew, he kept putting his head on his paws, and I was clicking and treating, and within one training session, I taught him head down. Now, what's also interesting about using that technique is because it's something they naturally do on their own, sometimes if you can train something using capturing as a method, they will learn it solid. So I could go months without asking Captain to put his head down and then bring it back and say head down, and he gets it almost instantly. And in fact, he's even generalized it a little bit, which not all dogs do. He could be laying on his side and lift up his head, and I say head down, and he actually will put the side of his head down, like on a bed or the floor. So that's another technique. Whenever we're doing this training, another part of just basic training is you need to have valuable treats. If you're only using kibble, you may struggle to train your dog because they get kibble all the time. And if it's a hard skill to learn, they need a higher value treat. They need something like hot dogs or cheese or some kind of meaty, smelly dog treat. Because just like you, if you went to work and your boss didn't pay you, you probably wouldn't show up for work anymore. And our dogs are doing these things because we want them to. Captain had no interest in learning how to do a head down, but because we were making it a game together and I was giving him treats, he was willing to play with me. So these are all concepts that you're going to learn in this chapter about training your dog. And once you understand these concepts more in a big picture, it makes it easier for you to be able to problem solve on your own if your dog is doing a behavior or you want to teach them a behavior. So this chapter was designed to help you help your dog. So I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you in chapter 7.